Welcome to a People for Effective Government online event. I'm PEG board member Dave Wilson, and I will be co-moderating tonight's event along with another PEG board member, Jenny Darrell. PEG is a nonprofit, Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Its mission is to support approaches to governing which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've held in-person public forums and online events like this one for over 3 years. PEG works to encourage sincere and civil discussions on the challenges that face our nation and seeks to promote effective solutions to those challenges by presenting public forums on a variety of relevant topics. As a reminder, the views presented by tonight's guest speaker are his own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in any political activity of any kind. Our audience is welcome to submit brief questions at any time via the Q&A feature. Please limit your questions to 2 or 3 sentences. You're welcome to ask several questions, but please submit only 1 question at a time. Our speaker will answer as many questions as possible before we end the forum around 8:30 p.m. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted on our website pegnow.org within a couple of weeks. The topic of tonight's forum is disinformation, misinformation, lazy information, and Spokane trends. Tonight's forum will explore how we can distinguish between competing claims to the facts amid the cacophony of today's media. At a national level, the need has led to the creation of groups such as factchecker.org. In regional news, the Seattle Times often runs stories under fact focus to correct claims falsely made. And at the local level, we have Spokane Trends. While less ambitious and restricted to socioeconomic phenomena that are measurable, Spokane Trends serves a purpose not too different. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Patrick Jones. His presentation will consider some general issues of our society's ability to process information and then look at how Spokane Trends may help process local information. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Jones tonight. He's a big deal in Spokane and in our region. Dr. Patrick Jones has been the executive director of Eastern Washington University's Institute for Public Policy and Economic Analysis since its inception in 2002. And it is in Dr. Jones' role at EWU that he leads and produces Spokane Trends, and I should add, Trends websites for 10 other counties in our region. The Institute provides data on a variety of critical issues facing local governments, businesses, and nonprofit groups around the Northwest. When local leaders in these areas need data and facts, they look to Spokane Trends and Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones has a PhD in Applied and Agricultural Economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's been the chair of the Spokane Mayoral Council of Economic Policy and Forecasting since 2008 and has served as a member since 2003. He's a member of the Washington State Data Center, which is affiliated with the U.S. Census. And Dr. Jones has also served as a board member of the Association of University Business and Economic Research Bureaus, as chair and member of the Spokane Entertainment Arts and Convention Advisory Board, on the Spokane Area Economic Development Council Board of Directors. He's also served on the Spokane Convention and Visitors Bureau Board of Directors and as chair and member of the Washington Retail Association Board of Directors. For all of his contributions and work in our community, Dr. Jones was inducted in the Spokane Hall of Fame in 2016. And I also want to state for the record that Dr. Jones has been a big supporter of PEG since the very beginning and has done many favors for us in helping us line up speakers and use facilities at Eastern Washington University. So it's obvious that Dr. Jones brings a breadth of experience to this topic, so let's launch into this interesting discussion. Dr. Jones, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dave. And while I guess the slides are coming up on the screen, I'll just say it's a pleasure to see this forum continue in its third year, and I hope there will be many more years with this kind of a civic dialogue that has been the goal of all of you involved in PEG. So what I'd like to do tonight is start general and then end specific and see what you think about some of those examples I choose. But I thought before I got into some of the specifics, we really need to consider just how we process information. So hence the title, Misinformation or Disinformation, Misinformation, and Apathetic Information. So Dave or Jenny, do you have that PowerPoint pulled up, or do you want me to do that?
Jenny, can you enable my screen sharing again like you did this morning?
Okay, I can do that. Let's see.
A detail we forgot to do before we started. We practiced it this morning though, Pat, and it worked, so rest assured.
Okay, so why am I not seeing that? I will get that here quickly.
No pressure.
Screen share. Oh, co-host, that's what I did. There you go. You should be able to.
Okay, let's start the show.
Thank you, Dave.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, there you go. Just expand the slides and we'll go on to the next slide. So pursuing the facts has been quite an endeavor of mine over the last few years. It's been first and foremost a job, but I just want to point out it's also my worldview, and in the end, it's become my passion and maybe a mission. I've followed that beacon of light that says, shines out and says, facts really do matter. And if we look in the Bible, there's this famous verse that says, if we know the truth, it will set us free. But generally, I've come to this mission because I've been very motivated to see better decisions made, whether it's the private sector or the public sector. And just by way of background, my worldview is one of an empiricist. I've never been one to build castles in the sky, and never really been that good at theory. And where I trained at UW-Madison, it is a school known for its really strong statistics program, and not necessarily its theory that other economics department have in the country. So when I took the job in the fall, I looked at the job description that the president had written out for me, actually, that I was to, among other things, build a better database about Spokane so that we relied a lot less on anecdotes and more on fact. And for me, that was just music to my ears. Next slide, please. So This is Senator Daniel Moynihan, one of my heroes in this area. And you can see that he wrote something that's been widely repeated. It's become my tagline on my emails, and that is, we all have our own opinion, but we shouldn't all have our own facts. And with saying that, we do recognize that facts will change, but as a society, and I think he was approaching this not necessarily as an academic, but as a lawmaker, there has to be a common set of information to be able to decide. Because if we don't, if we end up arguing what the facts are, we just can't get away from square one. So I'm been making the case that if we have a common set of facts, what that does is, I call it, set the table for a policy discussion or a business decision, even if that decision might have disagreements among the different parties to that decision. So I can't stress this enough that as a society, we definitely need to agree to a common set of facts. Next slide, please. So it was that mandate to build a better database that I received so that we don't rely on anecdotes, along with meeting other organizations that led to what you're going to see tonight, if you haven't seen it already, Spokane Trends, or initially it was called Spokane Community Indicators. And Eastern was not alone in Spokane in thinking that we could do better than we had. And so at a conference in 2004, there were several people representing largely those organizations on the right-hand side that were very interested in seeing how other communities had done this. We came back to Spokane. We agreed we'd meet when we got back to Spokane. We met and said, you know, let's not build our own particular project, but let's get together and do it together. So we had months of meetings, this being somewhat of an academic crowd of planners and social scientists figuring out how best to do this and how we were going to proceed. And I think those were actually good discussions, and we'll touch on them just a bit. And then about halfway through, my shop at Eastern was fortunate enough to get receive a large grant from what was then the Inland Northwest Community Foundation, now known as Innovia, that really pushed up our work schedule. So next slide, please. We held many community meetings before the site was even designed. We had about 300 people over the fall of 2005, winter and spring of 2006. And I just would like to state strongly for the record that it was these groups of your fellow Spokanites, not the steering committee nor Eastern, that chose the measures that ended up on the Spokane Trends site. We did provide everyone with a set of guidelines that we thought was important, and I think in most cases were abided by. And then later that fall in 2006, the site was launched. So next slide, please. Since 2006, a lot has happened. This hasn't been a static project. We've had 3 more rounds of this community engagement to keep the indicators relevant. In many cases, that led to some changes in the mix of indicators that you see on the site. We had about the same number of people involved, about 250 to 300. And for my shop at Eastern, that's led to more opportunities to do projects, as Dave alluded to, throughout the West, which have been largely in Eastern Washington. So at the moment, Spokane is one of the longest lived projects in the US, and just by the number of measures it contains, is one of the largest. Next slide, please. In fact, at this moment, there are 190 different ways of looking at life in Spokane, and they're ordered in those categories which you see there in purple. People is really demographics. Priority Spokane is a community action organization that formed out of this entire project and has gone on to do some very good work. And we've carved out just a little bit of a section for the Priority Spokane measures that that group wants to feature. So next slide, please. How do we keep it going? Well, I'm proud to say that we've got some great students, and without those students, we just couldn't get this done. It's certainly at the level of financial commitment that we ask for. You know, students when they're students, and some of these are graduate students, they are on the cusp of starting to earn what they deserve, but for us, they're still students. And so we're able to take advantage of their skills at a relatively modest price. We're grateful for their work. Typically, we have 3 to 5 students at any given time, and we've got staff as well. At the top is my associate, Dr. Kelly Cullen, a fellow economist who does so much of the data work at our site. Financially, the support has come over the years from the city of Spokane and from my university. It's different in the other communities, of course. There's somewhat broader coalitions. And then in this year, we are going to be working with Priority Spokane to once more review the measures, and then Priority Spokane will set its own priorities in that process. So there are very few universities, if I can just put a little plug in, shameless promotion for the university. There are very few universities across the country that do this. So I'm very thankful that our university has seen fit to keep the fire burning. Next slide, please. So that was our intent as the group in 2004. And it's just been remarkable to think how much has changed since we started then, and somewhat of our naive faith in the facts being assaulted. And I just wrote down this quote that I read around Christmas time from the Wall Street Journal columnist Holman Jenkins, who I usually don't agree with, but he called it like it is when he said, "We have a lying problem in this country." And I know that's not a new insight, but you know, people are starting to call a lie now. And that's in response to what I regard as a escalation of really reckless disregard for the facts. In fact, it wasn't too long ago that I read the paper or saw on the news that there's this collection of information called alternative facts. And if you don't believe the facts from party B, then you can believe these alternative facts. And I just was astonished when I read that. Next slide, please. So I would recommend to anybody who is interested in this topic to read a book that was done, about 12 years ago called Unspun. It covers the gamut of perhaps the use of alternative facts in business and in politics. The authors are from University of Pennsylvania, and one of them leads the Annenberg Center for Public Policy. That's Kathleen Jameson. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Fact Check, and these are the folks who brought us Fact Check. So I used this book a little bit because they had some really pithy quotes that I thought you might want to ponder. Next slide, please. So here's what they say about the way we treat facts in our country. Very often it's called spin. And as they write, spin is nothing more than a polite word for deception. And I like that. They just call it like it is. Spinners mislead by means that range from subtle omissions to outright lies. And spin paints a false picture of reality by these various and sundry things that they list that I'm sure you have all run across in the course of your reading or listening to or watching in the last few years. Next slide, please. So, and they go further and end some of those quotes that I love, that spin is tolerated and even admired in some circles. In Washington, D.C., a good spin doctor is lauded, much like a 20-game winner in baseball. And I was reminded of that as I read an exit interview with a former staffer of a not-to-be-named U.S. senator who quit after January 6th because she made the point to her boss that this isn't a game, that there is deadly serious. So I'm equating spin, disinformation, deception, more or less in the same bucket. And I'm just going to say it's the purposeful dissemination of altered facts, of omissions, or simply making stuff up. So that's disinformation, and we're going to talk a bit about that. But I want to consider something else before we get there. And just by way of saying what I'm not going to talk about, and we could have the next slide, please. That's disinformation. And disinformation really is a notion, a concept that goes back to the supplier of bad information, of misinformation, of deception. So these are the purveyors. And I'm not going to talk about who's purveying and what's at work in that, because I'd like to sort of look at us as how we interpret that kind of information. But I just want to point out that disinformation has been with us for centuries. This picture is taken from England just before the D-Day invasion, as the Brits actually fooled at least some part of the German army, thinking that the invasion was going to take place along the Straits of Calais and not where it did. Currently, we see a terrific amount of espionage using disinformation among nation states. We know that this goes on in advertising, whether it's business or advertising in the political world. And Unspun really has some pretty hilarious examples. And they sort of uncover those tricks of the trade a little bit. But again, we're not going to talk about disinformation. So next slide, please. We're going to talk about how we interpret this misinformation. So that is our ability to process information. And according to Jackson and Jameson, and now hundreds of thousands of social scientists, they write, humans are not by nature the fact-driven, rational beings we like to think we are. We get the facts wrong more often than we think we do, and we do so in predictable ways. And I suspect if I had read this and pondered it in 2003 and 2004, I may have gone back to President Jordan at the time and said, President Jordan, I don't know whether we can succeed in this. Are you sure you want to do this? But that's a little tongue-in-cheek, because I do think we've made some strides here. So what I'd like to share with you tonight is just a few comments, what I've seen over the years, and how we can be better consumers of information. And I'm going to tap into, next slide, please, some of the evidence from economics and social science in general, but how we process information has generally changed economics since I left graduate school, and it spawned a whole new field called behavioral economics. And thankfully, that has led to the Nobel Prize being awarded to two of the most well-known practitioners, a psychologist actually at Princeton, now emeritus, and an economist at University of Chicago. And basically their argument, to dumb it down really badly, is that optimizing or real rational behavior just doesn't describe human behavior that often. And yet that's what we've been taught so often in economics to study and model and teach. So next slide, please. So psychologists and now economists have developed a laundry list of biases that keep us from rational decisions. And I just listed 3 here. There are many, many more. And I just thought that this cartoon, when it talked about how one makes a decision, even if it's a wrong decision, they're going to stick with it. And that's known as confirmation bias. There's something, default bias, which I think is naturally human. We want to take shortcuts. And in social science, we talk about a quick and dirty solution to a problem. And then there's this notion that we put undue weight on what easily comes to mind. And that is pictured on the next slide. I think it's the next slide. We can see that. No, the slide after this. So in general, though, what I think we have to recognize in ourselves is this notion of cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance sounds really fancy and maybe a little obscure, but it's nothing more than the statement that I think many of us already know, that if we hold deeply held thoughts, opinions, beliefs, once those thoughts, opinions, beliefs are confronted by the evidence, very often we don't change our mind. We're not that agile. And another way of saying it, perhaps more nicely, is that we will take consistency over rationality in most cases. So this is something that, as much as we would like to deny it, I think is just a part of being human. Especially, I think, as we get older and those deeply held beliefs become more deeply held. Next slide, please. So we get very little feedback, corrective feedback, in any structured way for areas in policy. There is a way that society has set up to challenge false claims, deception, misinformation through agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. But and I'm not a lawyer, but if you apparently look at all the precedents that have been brought based on cases brought before our court system, they basically rule that as consumers of politics and policy, we really are on our own, and government does not need to step in to correct that kind of misinformation. Next slide. So what can we do? What should we do? Well, I'm just going to list a couple of suggestions from the authors of Unspun, and then give you a couple more of my own that have come out of my own observations of the last 15 or so years. The first thing that Jackson and Jameson say is, no surprise, if you're trying to combat a bias, be careful of giving great weight to your own lived experience if you're trying to make general statements. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Indian tale of the 6 blind seers and the elephant. And you can see here that each of the seers has a different interpretation of what that elephant might be, ranging from a rope to a snake. So the bottom line for that particular point is, watch your anecdotes, just what I was told by Steve Jordan at the time. And let's try to use information that's based on a lot more evidence than our own. Number 2, I should have put this second. I'd like to go to the last bullet. Be able to counter argue, see the other side. I think we can all test ourselves as we go through a particular political debate or any sort of argument within ourselves or with friends, and be able to put yourself in the other side of the argument. I think one could probably take that and run with it for the rest of the night if we wanted to talk about this state of affairs and current affairs in politics. And then finally, just being open-mindedness, which is somewhat the same, to the evidence. And I would stress, though, that this is talking about evidence. And so this is basically saying, take the facts that you have and bring it to the argument or bring it to the policy question. Next question, or next slide. So as a social scientist, I think I need to say this because I've noticed this a lot. There's a real temptation for a lot of us to just want to stick with one number and know that so much of the information we deal with in the social sciences are based with are inherently uncertain. And it depends on the kind of information source that you're dealing with. And the two largest sources that I see are so-called administrative sources and surveys. And I think if you remember your college statistics, you remember that in a survey, if especially as a random survey, there should be a plus or minus or a margin of error around whatever you're trying to estimate. And then how do we tamp down some of that uncertainty or a lot of that uncertainty? Well, it's quite simple, just mathematically, that if we have surveys that pull large numbers, that should I wouldn't say do the job, but go a long ways to make our world a little less uncertain. And then finally, on administrative records, we should know that in most cases, they are pretty accurate because they come from good government agencies. We're going to go over a couple of those. Economic activity, be it GDP or income, student test scores, in this state coming from the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And for those who find some of that information difficult to accept, then I would encourage you to just go right to the source and read up on their methodology, which can be pretty boring, but it's out there on their websites telling folks how they do it. Okay, next slide, about how we can cope with sort of this challenge of doubt about our knowledge. Always consider the sources. So obviously we want to access what the facts are, but we really want to be good consumers, if you will, of where the information comes from. And I'm always astonished in my household. I get a comment that this information was found on the smartphone, or this information was found on the internet, and therefore it's accurate. And I just have to say, what source was it? And so if you read the cartoon here, I thought that was great because I think it unfortunately refers to the fact checking that a lot of people do, which is through social media. So consider where it comes from, the source. Is there an advocate behind the source, which sometimes is the case? If you really want to know that you know something, does the purveyor of the information show their work? And can the sources be verified? Next slide, please. So just to wrap up then, a little cliff notes on how we can improve our processing of information. Just be aware of our own biases. Be aware that we're not the rational creatures that perhaps we were taught in the economics class you took a few years ago. And Daniel Kahneman, who is really one of the great minds in this field, the Princeton psychologist, says, ask others to keep you honest. And he had a famous partnership with another Israeli-American academic psychologist named Amos Tversky. And I think they just lived that to the fullest. They were close enough, and they could just confront each other with what they thought was a false set of facts, or perhaps a wrong conclusion. So to the Spokane trends, what we'd like to do with the trends is actually confront ourselves and say, this is the best information that we think is possible to find for our community or communities, wherever the trends might be. And by the way, this is not obscure. This is easy to access. And we've taken, we think, pretty great pains to make it easy to understand. So before we turn to a few of the indicators, I just want to say, what do we mean by best information? Next slide, please. So here are some principles that we ask all our focus groups to consider as they nominated and then voted for their indicators. We want to have not a narrow focus, but a broad focus. We want to provide context for all our measures. So you'll see on the site that we benchmark against jurisdictions that are like us, so to speak. And then we always present information in a time sense, whether it's years, quarters, months. We try to offer short explanations in a very neutral language. And we've been asked to make that less neutral, perhaps less plain vanilla, but really don't want to go there because we're not trying to show any favor to a particular interpretation. And then we always want to show the data and show any calculations. And we have a tab on every indicator, which you'll see shortly, called download data that allows people to do that. And I've been surprised at times to find that that's actually accessed. Next slide. And the last set of part of these principles are that we, as I mentioned before, we need to have trusted sources. In our case, these sources are federal and state. That the acronym soup there, I don't have the time to go into, but I'll just say that I hope I can share with you my enthusiasm for the state of affairs we have in Washington, where we have, I think, a pretty good open government. And there are lots of data that are collected that are not available in other states like ours. So we want to be able to get easy access to these sources, which we do, I think. Again, we don't interject values. And finally, and most important in terms of the makeup of the information on the indicators or the trend site, is that these measures are deemed at that point in time as the highest importance to the community. All right, I think that's it, and we'll dive into the website itself. Is there another slide, Dave? Oh yeah, I would like to just say that as much as I enjoy my job, this is not academic work. The real motivation for me, besides being part of my job, and I'm sure the motivation for all those others at the start of the project, was to be able to answer the question that you may have heard in 1980, are we better off today than you were 4 years ago? Or are you better off today than you were a decade ago? And sometimes that's easy to determine, sometimes it isn't. And I'll try to spend a little bit of time on that tonight if we have time. And then a very sort of common way of posing that question is whether the needle is moving in the right direction. So that concludes a lot of prefatory material before we get into some of the trends, but let me go into the trends right now. And Jenny, if I could have the control of the screen, I will take us to the website.
I think Dave has to stop sharing, but there.
Okay, now I will try to share. Can you see the screen that says, that shows the website?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So here it is for those of you who haven't been on it before, Spokane Trends. And I'm going to take you right to one of the key demographics that I thought would be kind of fun to start with. And this is under population. You can see that under every category, we have subcategories. And we're going to look at something called median age. Median in the general sense of the word is nothing more than a number that divides a set of numbers into two equal parts. And this is what I call the most boring graph on the entire trend site, but it tells a story. And that's, in a word, what we like to do with the trends is to tell a story. So you can see that these three lines are almost all together. And to me, that is rather remarkable. So our age structure is not that different from the United States. We're a little younger. And it's not that different from the state of Washington. We're about the same. Now, why might that be interesting? Well, before I came back to academia, I was running a family business, and people found out I was an academic by training, and they would start talking about all sorts of social science things. And very often I was told that, you know, Spokane is really kind of a town for retirees and old. I could only shrug my shoulders because that was in the 80s and 90s, and I didn't have much recourse to go and look at something like this online. And I would just say, well, I'd have to see the data before I say that. But for those people of my generation who left Spokane because in that day it seemed old, I would say, well, it may have been that way then, it isn't that way now. So there is a more complicated way or a richer way of looking at this sense of how old we are, but it's called population by age groups. I'm not going to show it to you. It has a population pyramid over time that gets a little busy. But I wanted to take this opportunity just to say, this is the way an indicator looks for us. We have the graph. We have the legends. So if you want to click off one of the comparisons, you can do that, click it back on. There is a section called more information, which we describe really what's going on here in, we think, pretty brief language. And then for those indicators that come from a survey that have margins of error, we are able to determine for you whether this is a statistically significant change, in this case increase, or not. And that's always preferred if we can get that sort of information, because that tells you with a little more certainty, if not a lot more certainty, that there has been a change, that the needle has moved. And then finally, this would take you, I'm not gonna spend the time doing this. So you click on this, this will take you directly to the one table within the census, in particular the American Community Survey part of census, that has the information. So you can see and actually manipulate the data a little more. If you want to have just the data that we use in this, you can click on the Excel spreadsheet and look at those, if you will, pre-populated rows. Now, in many of our cases, in about 55 indicators out of 190, we have data at the level of the city of Spokane, the city of Spokane Valley. And this is going to be sort of a leitmotif if I were to be able to talk to you about the cities of the Spokane County, that they really are different. And so this is nothing more than comparing the age, the median age of the city of Spokane to the age of Spokane County. And you can see that the city is quite a bit younger. In these sorts of measures, a year or two actually is a pretty big deal. So that's once over lightly of just a seemingly innocuous indicator that I think tells a lot. Now, let me just focus on something that we spend a lot of time talking about in public policy circles, I think, in our community, and that's looking at our age, our race and ethnicity makeup. Now, this is going to be kind of a classic look that we do because we have two comparisons we have the United States, we have the state of Washington, and we have the Lilac County, in this case, Spokane. So just let me click some of this off. And you can see that compared to the US, the county is considerably less diverse than the US as a whole. We all know that. So for me, that's no new news, but I think it is worthwhile just seeing just how different we are. You can see that it's this total of 2 or more races plus Latinos, Hispanics, plus African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and others is over 41%. I think it's close to 42. We're about 18.7% as of the census. By the way, this is a census number. These numbers are estimates in between the census dates. So we had a census count here, we have a census count here. And for many of the variables or indicators that we rely on census for, we'll only have 2019 because the American Community Survey was not deemed worthy enough due to poor response rates during the COVID year 2020. So there will be a bit of a gap in a lot of our indicators going forward. For this one, because it's one of the essential ones that was on the short form, that's not the case. So here we have Spokane at 18.7%, and I think the state of Washington's around 30%. So we kind of know that. Yeah, I'm sorry, a little below 35%. So we kind of know that. But what is interesting to me is this story, not the comparison story, but the growth over time. And you can see just eyeballing this, that the 2020 number is quite a bit higher than the 2010 number or share. And if you just do the math and create a compounded growth rate, what you'll find is that the growth rate of minorities in our county is considerably higher than the growth rate in the US and in the state of Washington. So, you know, as we talk about race and ethnicity in our community, we need to recognize, yes, it's low, but it's actually growing faster than the US or the state as a whole. Now, I'd like to just point out again, with this notion of the tale of two cities, that there are differences between the city of Spokane and the city of Spokane Valley. This is the city of Spokane, and you can just add up these at your leisure to see that this is close to 21 to 22%, as opposed to the county average of 18%. And it's considerably lower than the county average in the city of Spokane Valley. So there are some differences even within our county. What even may be the wrong adverb. We should expect them to be. I guess that's true of most communities. So those are two demographic pieces I just wanted to point out to you. Since PEG has had quite a bit on elections and Secretary of State visits, 2 of them, I thought it would be useful to see these 2 indicators. And this is looking at something that I think we all pay attention to, is what is the voter turnout? And it's a measure of that, of course, but this little section on civic involvement is really a measure of how engaged we are as a community. And there are other measures that attempt to do this, but we don't find them continued over time. So we really can't produce them in something like Spokane Trends because they may be just part of a study. But this is looking at the voters who are registered, who actually who voted in elections. These are presidential elections, so these are midterm elections, and these are the off-year elections. And you can see that there's been a really divergent trend over the last 25 years, that we're having greater participation in presidential elections, but at the local level, at municipal elections, that's a pretty steep decline from 60% in the 90s down to the most recent number, which we saw here in Spokane, was 39%. So that's one takeaway for me anyway. But the major takeaway here is when we measure this, and this is what's touted in the coverage of the news, we're only looking at half the story, and that is those voters who are registered, because it turns out that many voters are not registered. And this is our attempt to get a handle on that. We don't know for sure exactly who could vote, because we know that in our country and in our state still, most felons are not allowed to vote. And of course, non-citizens are not allowed to vote. So this is looking at the share of the folks who showed up to register to vote. And thankfully, over the last few years, there's been a pretty rapid increase in that, going from the mid 70s to the mid 80%. So kudos to our community for having do that, for somehow getting that done. But the fact of the matter is that if we want to look at the voter turnout in the best sense of the word, which is the number of people voted who could have voted, whether they're registered or not, you have to multiply this percentage times the prior percentage, so 80% by whatever vote you want to look at, and you can see that that's going to be in the 50s or 60% range. And comparatively speaking, internationally speaking, that is not a very high turnout. I just checked before I started my talk tonight, and the German turnout, broadly defined, was in the most recent federal elections, which they just had, was 85%. So you can see we're a far cry from that if we're in the, let's say, mid 60s, maybe high 60s in Spokane. Okay, I've got 4 or 5 more indicators that I thought I'd talk about, but I think I'm going to run out of time. So I may just do 2 more. And I was going to cover some economics oriented indicators, but I'm going to jump straight to something that you also have had some PEG talks about. And this is the criminal justice system, criminal justice reform, policing in the era that we're in. And I'm going to have us look at incarceration rates. And the background for this particular indicator is that it was one of those that came out as voted in by the last round of focus groups. And I think I don't need to explain why this might be important, but there is this supposition that there's a differential sense of justice when it comes to arrest and then incarceration. So there was really no indicator that we could take off the shelf to do this one. And so we basically developed this on our own. And it has 2 components, and they're both very solid components. We have the incarceration rate. Let me just flip over and show you this. We have the incarceration rate from the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs on an annual basis. So these are the annual averages. And then we had to dig out the adult population by race. This took a little more than we thought. It's not as easily apparent in a time series as we thought it might be. But what you end up with then is the share of the adult population that's in jail compared to the total adult population by race and ethnicity. No, I'm sorry, just by race. So our races here are Black, Native American, white, which includes Hispanics, and then Asians and others. So here is what the data show when we did the calculations starting in 2011. And you can see we have them through 2012. This is the incarceration rate for Blacks at 1.8%. This was the peak. It said that 1.8% of all African-American adults in Spokane County were on average in jail that year. This is the percentage of Native Americans. 1.1% of all Native Americans were on average in jail in 2015. These are whites, including Hispanics and Latinos that were incarcerated, was 0.2% of the adult population. And then Asians was not even 1% of the population, well, rounded to 1. So that's, to us, when we developed this, we had no idea what this would look like. It kind of took our breath away. So we said, well, what's the overall rate of incarceration of adults? And you can see that the overall incarceration rate is, I'm sorry, let's go there, 0.23%, 0.22%, 0.16%. It's a different scale here. So just pay attention to the different scales. And let's then just make this a little more interesting by looking at the incarceration rate of Blacks in our community versus the incarceration rates, same definition across the state. Again, these are data from the sheriffs and police chiefs. And you can see it's almost twice as high in our community as it is statewide. Thankfully, it has come down. And I don't know what's behind that, whether COVID and COVID jail releases were part of it, but it has come down. And let's look at then Native Americans. And you can see also a real disproportionate ratio. I'm sorry, this is African Americans. Let me go there. There we go. Still a pretty strong gap between Native Americans here and Native Americans statewide. So again, I'm not gonna jump to any conclusions because I have none. I just would like to point this out, and I hope it will benefit further discussion. So I'm going to wrap up here in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to end on a little brighter note, and this is going to look at education. One of the, well, in fact, the first priority that came out of this community action, collective action effort by Priority Spokane in 2008 and 2009 was on high school graduation rates. So we're going to take a peek at that and look at where this community is with high school graduation rates. Ideally, I would like to show you a time series that goes back another 10 years, but what happened in 2010, 2011 in that particular school year was the OSPI, the state of Washington, changed its methods, and prior years just became incomparable to the new method, which is based on a cohort, which is a better method, which has been nationally adopted now, I think, in almost every state. So this is looking at the share of the kids who enter 9th grade and who graduate 4 years later, deducting for transfers to other Washington schools. If they transfer out of state, we lose them. But if they transfer within state, we are able to keep them and they join a cohort in another school. So this is looking at the overall result for the 13 school districts in the county. And I can just tell you that when we started this work prior to Spokane in 2008, even with an old methodology that was not quite the same, but it was close. The graduation rate was about 70%. And then within 2 or 3 or 4 years of some pretty hard work, it had gone up to 81%. And since then, it's gone up to 85%. And you can see that compared to the state, that it has done, we as a community have done pretty well. It still raises the question, though, is 85% good enough? And again, that's something that a site like the Trends is not going to answer. That's a value judgment that many of us have our own thoughts on, and be happy to share those with you. But we're just depicting reality the way it is. You click here under city, you can see the districts of Central Valley versus the city of Spokane versus the county average. But I'll stop here and just wrap up with a couple thoughts. And I don't want to be too pushy about this, but for many of the indicators, or for much of the information that we as a community can use, I don't think there's an excuse for accepting wrong information with something like Spokane Trends, knowing that we're not addressing national issues, we're not addressing state issues, and we're not addressing political sort of claims in most cases that can be, I think, adequately dealt with by an organization like Fact Checker or what the Seattle Times has done. But we can, I think, inform with 190 different measures of life in Spokane, we can inform lots of questions or claims in our community. And so for those who don't use this, these are my lazy consumers of information, or my apathetic consumers of information, because we take great pains to keep this, my staff and I, to keep this going, obviously with financial support, and to keep it current. And it's always there, it's always available. There's no entry fee to go and look at what you're seeing. So just to circle back to where we started this conversation about our ability to process information, I've become persuaded, certainly reading a bit of Unspun, or reading the book Unspun, and reading Daniel Kahneman book on thinking fast and slow, that overcoming our biases completely is probably a pretty quixotic task. That's something that I don't think we want to set ourselves up to do. But I would like to say that we might be able to weaken our biases, and just to be able to be aware of them, and being aware of them, then know that maybe, you know, I should behave a little differently when I think this way or that way. So at the very least, one bias that Spokane Trends should be able to help, not solve, but definitely tamp down, is this availability bias, which is the tendency just to react with anecdotes and with some of our own experiences. And I say this also with some empirical background, because I've had many, many comments over the last 16 years from this project and others that has been very helpful in solving some information questions and therefore some decisions. So my passion's still there. My motivation to follow Daniel Moynihan's admonition to all of us is still pretty darn strong. And that is, we'll all do better if we can embrace a common set of facts. And so thank you so much, Dave and Ginny. And I hope I didn't extend too long over my time.
No, you did a great job, Patrick. We really appreciate it. It was a great presentation, and it's a great website. If you haven't had a chance to go to this website, you should, and play with it. There's a lot of fascinating information there. We've seen a couple comments come in on the chat. echoing those comments. So it's time for some questions from the audience, and if you haven't done so already, please submit your questions in the Q&A feature. And I'm going to call in Jenny Darrell, my co-moderator, and she and I will be alternating with the questions from the audience. And Jenny, if you're ready, why don't you go ahead with the first question from the audience?
Okay, I will do that. We have a gentleman who asks, or he referred to an article from the Atlantic magazine in November by Ayad Akhtar. The title of the article was "The Singularity is Here. Artificial Intelligent Advertising Technology is Poisoning Our Societies." And he writes about AI manipulating feedback loops that feed our personal narcissism and reinforce and build our biases. So his question is, in the commercial marketing realm, using AI to bring us products and services, how can we counter the power of that manipulated social media?
Well, my immediate and kind of flip answer is, why are you on social media? How much social media do we need to consume? And is that a place where we as humans should have lots of discourse and dialogues? Having said that, I know that that's a flip answer and that people are still going to use it. I don't know enough about AI to be able to respond to that. I know there's lots of scenarios that have been painted about the ability of AI to basically chart our future as humans, and reminded of the computer HAL in the movie A Space Odyssey 2001. I just don't know whether we're there. My reading is that we're not there. But I would say that if you really want to engage on social media, it's unfortunately more incumbent now than ever to point out that there are good sources of information. And it's just something that I think one has to do that maybe a generation ago we didn't have to do. And that is sort of the next question from Jan Wigan, because there was a considerable amount more trust in government. And again, I don't have any magic bullets for this other than to say, if you're really interested in knowing how this information is arrived at, then walk a mile in the shoes of the people who put it together. To some degree, I have in my job. And I've just been so impressed with the people I've met in, if you will, the data agencies of both the federal government and the state government. I mean, these are people without axes to grind, without bones to pick. And so I just think we need to come back to this notion that if this isn't or pose the counterfactual question, if this isn't the best set of facts, tell me where it is, because I assure you, these are very committed, well-educated, and from my take, apolitical civil servants. So, Jan, it's just unfortunate that we live in the world we do, but that's why I ended my little talk with a bit of a defiant note. I think we just have to keep this in front of people, that these are the best sources of information that we have.
Now, Patrick, just so you know, the audience members can't see the questions.
Oh.
So the only ones that can see them are you and Jenny and I.
Okay.
So
well, Jan Wigan asked, what do we do with the I guess the calling into question some of our government information. So.
Okay, so the next question is, what is the percentage of Asians to total population?
Yeah, that's on our site. That's on our site. If you were to click on what I showed you under demographics, and I don't have the screen right now, control of the screen right now, but you can find it by looking at migration and immigration, and you will find that it's less than 2% in the county.
Jenny, you want the next one?
I'm going to move over to the chat because there's a question that's a little bit of a different take on almost the same topic. But since you're depending a lot on government data, do you ever think or feel that a government program funding skews the data?
No.
Okay.
I do not. And I'd have to ask myself how that might happen. You know, because again, the data come from two sources. The data are either surveys, and I think the survey, the people who lead surveys, certainly at the federal level, are some of the best statisticians, applied statisticians in the world. And I can't imagine that they would somehow want to or even be able to bias the results of a survey. The second source of information would be administrative records. And there might be a bad apple or two doing something with some data. Again, hard for me to imagine, but given that these data sets are so massive, I would find it difficult to think that they could change really the outcome of most of the data sets. So yeah, that's my sense of that.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is incarceration rates, comparing white population, including Hispanic community, may not be giving an accurate picture. Is there a movement toward accurate data collection in the criminal justice system?
Well, I can't comment on whether it's accurate or not. My presumption is that there's no malevolent intent to be disaccurate or inaccurate. I think maybe the question is, should we not be separating out Latino Hispanics from non-Latino Hispanic Caucasians? And my answer would be absolutely. I think that should be done. So, what happens over time at least has happened over time in data collection, is that comments like this, if they're common enough, they actually, in my experience, they get listened to, and then certain data fields are added going forward that provide that kind of additional richness or additional accuracy. So, if your point is about Hispanics versus non-Hispanics, I think that's, especially as we get into communities that we work in the central part of the state, I think that's absolutely critical. So the answer is we'll look into that. That's one for us to follow up with WASPIC. That's the data agency that we use to get that information.
Okay, I'll take a question from the Q&A. You mentioned that the media is starting to call verifiably false statements lies. Is there a downside to this in terms of creating a problem with others who might not see these statements as false? So you're attacking someone's belief system, perhaps?
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. That is a good question. I think most people don't escalate the language too fast. I don't watch too many press conferences, but I don't think that you have reporters saying that's a lie in most cases I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, to the people at the lectern. I do think, though, that if something is a false statement is committed time in and time out, that you have to be a little stronger in the language. And that's where I would go ahead and call it a lie. So, you know, first time, second time, you get a pass. But if you continue to do it, at least this is just Patrick Jones speaking, I'm not going to give you a pass. And I think, just like we've heard from some other speakers, we have to plant a flag in the ground that, you know, facts are sacred, and not sacred, but they're precious. And we need to protect their veracity. And to continue to attack them, it just erodes all sorts of things in civil society. So anyway, Mark, that's my answer.
Here's one from the chat. What are your thoughts about making media literacy a required course, like is civics education for Washington State High School graduation?
Boy, that is a great idea. I was reading my Wall Street Journal yesterday, and it's newspaper, or it's Press Literacy Week or something to that effect. I didn't know that, but I was happy to see it. I bet not too many other people know it. And so there was a little 8th-page ad on the Wall Street Journal talking about that. And, you know, I think this could easily be folded into a civics requirement in our public schools. And I don't know how far along we are in Spokane County with our schools having that requirement. I do know that George Nethercutt was working on that for a while, but it wouldn't be that hard to have 1 or 2 periods of that kind of a class, having the kind of discussion you've had tonight from me, just about how we sift and winnow information. So yes, enthusiastic, yes.
Okay, we have a question going back to your data on incarceration and wondering why, or do we know why, the rate of African Americans in Spokane incarcerated is at a higher rate than the state of Washington?
That's the $64,000 policy question. And again, I kind of glossed over this in my notes, but we just don't have time, and also just we don't have the expertise in our shop to answer all those kinds of questions. So what we present is typically the what and not the why. And the why, I think, in this case, is a particularly challenging question. I'm not a criminologist, I'm an economist. I might have some thoughts, but I wouldn't even deign to think that they're working hypotheses right now. But I think what it points out is that it's big enough for that gap is large enough for there to be some effort to try to understand that. And again, when we have used the Spokane trends as a springboard for Priority Spokane, one of our questions, or one of our pointers to the groups have been, tell us what you think are the biggest gaps are that you see in the data. Because those gaps should really inform what our priorities might be. So I would think this would rise to that particular kind of status.
Here's a question out of the Q&A. Is the Washington Policy Center a source of reliable information?
I hate to say no. I think it's a source of reasoned opinion, but it's nothing like the stuff we try to do at the Institute, where we just try to present the facts. And again, not take sides. I'm not getting paid by the university or the clients across the state to argue a particular point of view. And Policy Center does. So, you know, I would say that and I've called up Mr. Guppy a couple times saying, are you sure you want to use that fact? Are you sure you want to use that piece of information? Because, you know, kind of my role I think in our state is to say, I don't think that's a correct fact. And so I think it's good to have think tanks, and I admire their success, but they're not purveyors of, if you will, the plain vanilla facts the way we are.
Do you know if the population growth in Spokane has changed during the COVID years?
Yeah, I was just looking at that today, and actually in the city of Spokane, it went up very little. And I think that runs a little contrary to what people had thought. Because I think there's been this supposition, again, based on anecdotes, that there's been this wave of urban refugees from LA, San Francisco, Seattle, coming over and finding their dream place in Spokane and being able to work remote. The data don't seem to support that in terms of total population growth. Our in-migration in 2021, between 2020 and 2021, was pretty low. And for the city itself, I just gave a presentation yesterday to the city council on this. The city picked up only 400 new people in COVID year 20 by 2020 and part of 2021. So don't think that's at play.
You just pointed out that we now have CY instead of fiscal year, we have COVID year.
Right.
Dave?
Here's one from the chat. Is there also data available on public high school on-time graduation rate by race and gender?
There sure is. Yeah, and we have that, I think. Just let me check. We didn't have that originally, but if you go on the trend site, we have high school graduation rates for low income and homeless students, high school graduation rates for non-white students. So yes, that is available. And as you may expect, it's not nearly as high.
Jenny?
Okay, I'm going to ask one that's not on the board. Affordable housing and homelessness have been challenging issues for Spokane and many cities and areas around the country for quite a while. What did the data tell you about how to address this problem and what to expect in the future?
Oh boy, well, this is where I could spend another hour just walking you through about 6 or 7 different indicators that I think tell a good story or tell a story. And the story that I've told when I've been asked this by the press or some other folks is that our supply, and this is not at all unique to me, but our ability to produce homes, to produce housing, let me say, has really tapered off. And there's many reasons for that, but we're just not producing the housing stock that we need for the demand that exists. So, you know, that doesn't necessarily, well, there is some connection to homelessness, especially those that are homelessness due to being poor and priced out of a roof over their heads. But in general, we have a real hard time producing low, let's say, housing that would sell in the lowest quintile or the lowest quartile of the price range. It just is difficult, I think, for a lot of builders to build homes like that. And so therefore you're not finding them. We just saw the average value of new construction in the city of Spokane, again, something we track for the city in a separate project, for this last year was about 340 odd thousand for a new home. So just ask yourself how many starting households can look to a price tag of close to 350,000 and make that pencil. So I think we just need to do all we can to be creative, to think of supply solutions. And that runs the gamut from multifamily to single family that's maybe a little unconventional, to the sort of discussions we're seeing on city council that are, I think, part of some of the solutions that are being tried in the larger metro areas. And this is, again, just a little comment I'd like to make to everybody. You know, I'm a native here, third generation Spokane boy. I went to Shadle Park, left for 20 years and came back. And I think a lot of us who are in that boat, we always think of Spokane as being a relatively small town. But you know, right now we are in the top 100 metro areas, just who we are. And then once you add Coeur d'Alene in, which might be officially added into our metro definition within a few months, then we're in the top 70 metro areas in the country. And so with that comes sort of the classic design of house, not design, the classic pattern of housing in a lot of communities, in a lot of metro areas, which is very expensive within certain parts of the city. And then you have to travel a long ways to the fringes, to the urban growth boundary and beyond, to be able to get cheap enough housing. So, you know, we could spend the rest of the night talking about housing solutions, but I think maybe you've already had a session on that. I think you have a couple, right?
Yeah. Do you, other than the government agencies that you mentioned as trusted sources, do you have any other sources specifically in the media that you consider as trusted sources, or certain authors?
What was the question about media sources?
Yeah. Do you have any that you consider to be trusted sources, like you do the government agencies?
Yeah, depends on what kind of information you're talking about. You know, you know, for financial information, you know, that's a pretty straightforward answer. For other information, you know, let me just go sideways here a little bit. Because when we first started out in 2004, there was this hope that we would be able to generate somehow, some way in this community, our own surveys, our own data. That is really expensive. And the one survey that I have been a part of tangentially that at one point was going to be continued, I'm afraid it's not going to be continued right now, was from the Health District, a biannual survey of quality of life. That's a $100,000 bill. And so, you know, I think that very few places are able to do that. I will say, though, that there are some non-for-profit, you know, and some foundations that I deeply respect that do surveys. One of them being the Pew Center, the other in healthcare being the Kaiser Family Foundation. And I'm sure if I thought about it more, I'd be able to give you a few more. But there are some foundations out there that have the resources to actually engage in that kind of polling. Not polling, surveying.
Jenny?
I think I don't have any more. I'm looking.
Well, I think we probably have reached the point. It's a little after 8:30. Patrick, do you have any closing thoughts before I make my concluding remarks for tonight?
Well, I saw that somebody didn't know the website. And so if you just Google Spokane Trends, you'll find it.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Patrick?
No, I just want to say that, you know, being able to make the determination of are we better off today takes some time. And so what I've told communities that we've started work in over the last 3 or 4 years is that, you know, you'll really start, I think, being able to pull a lot of value out of this once you get some history and you can look at the current year versus 5 years prior. Because there's a lot of noise or a lot of different reasons why there might be some year-to-year variation. And so I almost never put a whole lot of weight in this year versus last year, but I'm going to put a lot more weight in this year versus 5 years ago, or this quarter versus the average of the quarters from 2 years ago, so something to that effect. So the other thing I'll say too, Dave, is this. The more we do this, the more numerate we become as a society. And I think we talk about high school civics, but one of the things I would like to see is our ability to interpret information like this. You know, to me, I wouldn't like falling off a log, but it's relatively straightforward, but for some people it isn't. And so the degree that we kind of can engage ourselves with these sorts of websites or this sort of discussion, I think will lead us to a better ability to interpret information that's expressed in numbers. And with that, I'll stop.
Well, thank you. That's well said. That's a very good point. So to the audience, I'd like to say thank you for watching tonight. PEG is a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. If you are finding these events helpful, please join us as a member and make a donation to PEG. We are a nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. Again, please visit our website at pegnow.org. On behalf of the PEG board and membership, we wish to extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Jones for this important discussion. Thanks also again to the audience. You are the reason we do this work. A video of this evening's forum will be posted on the PEG website in a couple of weeks. We're also in the process of scheduling other forums for early 2022, so stay tuned and you will hear from us soon on the next forum. Thanks again for coming tonight, and thanks again to Dr. Jones. Jenny, thanks for your help. And good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you all.
Good night.